We are on to chapter 5, Shells. The concept that corresponds to a shell is so clear, so hard, and so sure that a poet, simply unable to draw it, and reduced rather to speaking of it, is at first at a loss for images. He is arrested in his flight towards dream values by the geometrical reality of the forms. And these forms are so numerous, often so original, that after a positive examination of the shell world, the imagination is defeated by reality. Here it is nature that imagines, and nature is very clever. One has only to look at pictures of the ammonites to realize that as early as the Mesozoic age, mollusks constructed their shells according to the teachings of a transcendental geometry. Ammonites built their homes around the axis of a logarithmic spiral. A very clear account of this construction of geometrical forms by life may be read in Manon Erzon's excellent book. A poet naturally understands this aesthetic category of life, and Paul Varet's essay Les Coquillages, Shells, fairly glows with the spirit of geometry. For Valery, a crystal, a flower, or a shell stands out from the usual disorder that characterizes most perceptible things. They are privileged forms that are more intelligible for the eye, even though more mysterious for the mind, than all the others we see indistinctly. For this poet, whose thinking was essentially Cartesian, a shell seems to have been a truth of well-solidified animal geometry, and therefore clear and distinct. The created object itself is highly intelligible, and it is the formation, not the form, that remains mysterious. As to the form it would eventually assume, a final decision governed the initial choice that involved knowing whether the shell would coil to the left or to the right. This original vortex has provoked endless commentary. Actually, however, life begins less by reaching upward than by turning upon itself. But what a marvelously insidious, subtle image of life, a coiling vital principle would be. And how many dreams the leftward-oriented shell, or one that did not conform to the rotation of its species, would inspire. Paul Valéry lingered long over the ideal of a modeled or carved object that would justify its absolute value by the beauty and solidity of its geometrical form, while remaining unconcerned with the simple matter of protecting its substance. In this case, the mollusk's motto would be one must live to build one's house, and not build one's house to live in. However, in a second stage of his meditation, Valéry becomes aware of the fact that a shell carved by a man would be obtained from the outside, through a series of innumerable acts that would bear the mark of touched-up beauty, whereas the mollusk exudes its shell. It lets the building material seep through, distill its marvelous covering as needed. And when the seeping starts, the house is already completed. In this way, Valéry returns to the mystery of form-giving life, the mystery of slow, continuous formation. But this reference to slow formation is only one stage of his meditation, and his book is an introduction to a museum of forms. The collection is illustrated with watercolors by Paul A. Robert, who, before he started to paint, had prepared the object by polishing all the valves. This delicate polishing laid bare the roots of the colors, which made it possible to participate in a will to color, in the very history of coloration. And at this point, the house turns out to be so beautiful, so deeply beautiful, that it would be a sacrilege even to dream of living in it. A phenomenologist who wants to experience the images of the function of inhabiting must not be subject to the charms of external beauty. For generally, beauty exteriorizes and disturbs intimate meditation. Nor can a phenomenologist follow for long the conchologist, whose duty it is to classify the immense variety of shells, and who is looking for diversity. However, a phenomenologist could learn a lot from a conchologist if the latter were to share with him his own original amazement. For here too, as with nests, enduring interest should begin with the original amazement of a naive observer. Is it possible for a creature to remain alive inside stone, inside this piece of stone? Amazement of this kind is rarely felt twice. Life quickly wears it down. And besides, for one living shell, how many dead ones there are. For one inhabited shell, how many are empty. But an empty shell, like an empty nest, invites daydreams of refuge. No doubt we over-refine our daydreams when we follow such simple images as these. But it is my belief that a phenomenologist should go in the direction of maximum simplicity, and therefore I believe that it is worthwhile proposing a phenomenology of the inhabited shell. The surest sign of wonder is exaggeration, and since the inhabitant of a shell can amaze us, the imagination will soon make amazing creatures, more amazing than reality, issue from the shell. In Jurgis Baltrushaitis's fine volume entitled Le Moyen Âge Fantastique, we find reproductions of antique jewels in which the most unexpected animals, a hare, a bird, a stag, or a dog, come out of a shell, as from out of a magician's hat. This comparison with a magician's hat will be quite useless to anyone who takes up his position in the very center where images develop. When we accept slight amazement, we prepare ourselves to imagine great amazement, and in the world of imagination, it becomes normal for an elephant, which is an enormous animal, to come out of a snail shell. It would be exceptional, however, if we were to ask him to go back into it. In a later chapter, I shall have an opportunity to show that in the imagination, to go in and come out are never symmetrical images. Large, free animals escape mysteriously from some small object, writes Baltrushaitis. And he adds, Aphrodite was born in these conditions. Beauty and magnitude cause spores to swell. As I shall show later, one of the powers of attraction of smallness lies in the fact that large things can issue from small ones. Everything about a creature that comes out of a shell is dialectical, and since it does not come out entirely, the part that comes out contradicts the part that remains inside. The creature's rear parts remain imprisoned in the solid geometrical forms, but life is in such haste when it comes out that it does not always take on a designated form, such as that of a young hare or a camel. Certain engravings show strangely mixed creatures, as in the case of the snail shown in this work by Baltrushaitis, with a bearded human head and hare's feet, wearing a bishop's mitre, and with 4 animal feet. The shell is a witch's cauldron, in which bestiality is brewing. According to Baltrushaitis, les souris de Marguerite de Bourgeois are full of grotesque figures of this kind. Several of them have discarded their shells and remained coiled in the form of the shell. Heads of dogs, wolves, and birds, as well as human heads, are directly attached to mollusks. And so, unbridled, bestial daydream produces a diagram for a shortened version of animal evolution. In other words, in order to achieve grotesqueness, it suffices to abridge an evolution. And the fact is that a creature that comes out of its shell suggests daydreams of a mixed creature that is not only half fish, half flesh, but also half dead, half alive, and in extreme cases, half stone, half man. This is just the opposite of the daydream that petrifies us with fear. Man is born of stone. In C.G. Jung's book, Psychology und Alchemy, we examine closely the figures shown on page 86. We see Melusines, not the romantic Melusines that spring from the waters of lakes, but Melusines that are symbols of alchemy, who help us to formulate dreams of the stone from which the principles of life are said to come. Melusine actually comes forth from her scaly, gravelly tail, which reaches back into the distant past and is slightly spiraled. We have not the impression that this inferior being has retained its energy. The tail shell does not eject its inhabitant. It is rather a matter of an inferior form of life having been reduced to nothing by a superior one. Here, as elsewhere, life is energetic at its summit, and this summit acquires dynamism in the finished symbol of the human being. For all dreamers of animal evolution have man in mind. In these drawings of alchemical Melusines, the human form issues from a poor, frayed form, to which the artist has devoted little care. But inertness does not incite to daydreaming, and the shell is a covering that will be abandoned. The forces of egress are such. The forces of production and birth are so alive that two human beings, both wearing diadems, may be seen half emerged from the formless shell in figure 11 of Jung's book. This is the Doppelkopfig, or two-headed Melusine. All these examples furnish us with phenomenological documents for a phenomenology of the verb to emerge. And they are all the more purely phenomenological in that they correspond to invented types of emergence. In this case, the animal is merely a pretext for multiplying the images of emerging. Man lives by images. Like all important verbs, to emerge from would demand considerable research, in the course of which, besides concrete examples, one would collect the heartily perceptible movements of certain abstractions. We sense little, or no more action in grammatical derivations, deductions, or inductions. Even verbs become congealed as if they were nouns. Only images can set verbs in motion again.